Hello, I'm Carly Krakow with you today on behalf of Jadaliyya and the Arab Studies Institute. Today, I'm very glad to be joined by Dr. Muriam Haleh Davis. Dr. Davis is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is also co-editor of Jadaliyya's Maghreb page. Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Davis.
It's a pleasure to be here and chat with you.
You recently wrote an essay for Jadaliyya titled, "This is the Voice of Algeria, Radio Corona International carries the torch of the Hirak." This was part of a special bouquet of pieces on the COVID-19 pandemic in relation to social mobilization in the Middle East, North Africa, and the US, which was introduced by Jadaliyya's Kylie Broderick. I want to go into more depth on some of the really interesting points that you make about the current moment for Algeria amid the pandemic. But before doing that, perhaps could you just begin by explaining for our viewers who might be less familiar a bit of the background? What is the Hirak movement? And perhaps explain for us the major significance of the March 2019 announcement that Algerian President Bouteflika would not be seeking a fifth term.
Sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So the Hirak is a movement, and it's a leaderless movement. So it's in line with some of the things we saw around the quote unquote Arab Spring or Arab uprisings, in that this was not a political party or a defined kind of platform, but a kind of spontaneous uprising of people who were really fed up with Bouteflika and also the system around him, whether that was in terms of corruption, of not having access to kind of the quality of life that they thought that they should be living based on the petrol reserves of Algeria. And so there was just a lot of built up frustration. Bouteflika himself has been in very bad health for the last decade or so. And so the kind of farce of Bouteflika as a leader became just too absurd for people to feel like this was a sign of respect for the Algerian population. And so this feels like a lifetime ago, but it began in February 2019. And again, it wasn't clear at the time, how significant this was. Was this just, one protest? But it evolved into a really amazing civil society movement. And I say that because this was about different forms of artistic expression. At the beginning, people called it the revolution of smiles, Thawrat al-Ibtisam, because the Algerian sense of humor, which for those of us who work on Algeria is quite well known, but we've actually published a bit on Jadaliyya about this. So I recommend highly to our viewers, if you need something politically uplifting right now, to go and check out some of the work from the Maghreb page. And so all of that really came to the fore in this very cross-generational and also very diverse political movement, which of course causes some tensions as well, which I don't want to gloss over. But this led to Bouteflika announcing he would not be running for a fifth mandate. And as a result, right now, Abdelmajid Tebboune is the president of Algeria and has announced a constitutional referendum scheduled to take place on the 1st of November. So that's a kind of quick overview of what's been happening over the last year or so.
Yeah, thank you so much for that great overview to really set the stage. And we'll also definitely link to any of the work you mentioned from Jadaliyya so people can read that and get more familiar. Now also turning to Radio Corona International specifically, or RCI, you write about how the regime in Algeria exploited the pandemic early on to disrupt the Hirak and prevent dissent, and then enter what you refer to in the piece as pirate radio. Abdullah Benaduda, who started RCI, describes the podcast as carrying the flame of the Hirak until the movement can retake the streets, as you note. And you reference Frantz Fanon in the piece by noting that he once remarked that radio had the power to create national communities, and that listening is not only a form of consumption, but rather an act of constitution. And then I just want to quote your words from the piece again. Really pointedly, you write, "While RCI calls itself the radio of the end of the world, it reminds us that another world is indeed still possible." So could you tell us why radio? Why is this particular medium so powerful here in this context? And what is RCI achieving both in the Algerian context and perhaps as an international example of a particular kind of activism and art in this COVID era?
Thank you. Those are wonderful questions. One of the things that, this story kind of came to me in a way. I had been in touch with some of the amazing people working for Radio Corona who very generously let me interview them. Faisal El Sahbi, Mariam Balkaid, both have been participating and contributing. And so I was listening to the podcast one day, and it's just so original, and both, you know, politically very serious, but also quite whimsical in many ways. And so I just want to kind of foreground that if I was able to do this piece, it's really because of the individuals doing the work day to day. And one of the things I think we're all facing in this political moment globally is, you know, what does politics look like? We have this global pandemic. A lot of us are feeling isolated from the kind of protests or activist work we were doing, you know, up until February. I know at UCSC we had a strike, a wildcat strike led by graduate students, which also featured in the bouquet. And so what happens to all that momentum? And of course, Algeria was in the throes of this really exciting political revolution. And so I think we're seeing two things. One is, you know, the powers that be, whether that's, you know, a university administration or a national government, using the pandemic for their own attempts to clamp down, on the one hand, but also really creative responses that are thinking in new ways, both about what does activism look like in a time when, you know, at least in the US, we can't go out into the streets yet, at least in terms of not wearing masks, right? We still have to be a little bit careful about what it looks like to all be in a hall together organizing a meeting, for example. And so as much as the Algerian regime, you know, attempted to say, okay, you know, we're going to clamp down on the Hirak, the Hirak protesters, it was very important to them that they were the ones to say, no, we're the ones who are going to call off the protests, right? This is us showing that we are not an infantilized population, that we know how to take care of ourselves, and that we actually have these local networks of care and mutual aid, which surpasses what the state has been able to do. And so one of the things that has happened with the Hirak is that it's transmutated in many ways into solidarity networks in neighborhoods to get medical equipment and to take care of people. And so it's interesting to me to see how these forms of solidarity and activism, you know, have been able to mutate and adapt. And so, you know, this is one way where the kind of artistic expression and humor of the Hirak has found a new outlet. The online satirical website El Manchar had been shut down for a period of time. It's actually now back up and running, which many of us are very happy about. It's hilarious. And so again, how to showcase this kind of amazing creative outpouring of political energy into something that people can participate in and feel part of. And so that's something I think that's really exceptional about RCI. And, you know, I'm not an expert in the longer history of radio, but when Fanon writes about radio, you know, he's writing about the fact that the French settlers in Algeria, and just a bit of context on Frantz Fanon, you know, third worldist thinker, revolutionary from Martinique, who comes to serve with the FLN during the War of Independence, who writes these amazing works, kind of an analysis of settler colonialism. And he remarks that the settlers, you know, the European French settlers, listened to this program called Radio Alger, and that it becomes a really important part of them feeling linked to France, right? You're sitting in North Africa, how do you feel like you're a Frenchman? And radio becomes one way to do that, that you can kind of cut yourself off from native language, native culture, and feel, you know, like a European thanks to this radio channel. And of course, you know, radio has, you know, for our listeners, probably Nasser's South al-Arab is better known as a revolutionary moment of third worldist radio. For those in the French context, you know, Charles de Gaulle kind of announces the French resistance on BBC radio during the Vichy occupation. So radio has played this really important political role. And at the same time, radio is a medium that can be used by governments, right? Like any media. I mean, now we think, you know, Facebook, Twitter, how do we know who's controlling all of this? But that debate has been around for some time. And so, you know, one of the things about pirate radio is whether it's broadcasting offshore so that certain laws don't apply, or using kind of bandit frequencies, it's been a way of circumventing some of those official attempts at imposing the control of news. And so, RCI takes place on SoundCloud, which I always am amused by, because right now I do all my lectures on SoundCloud. It's an easily available medium. You don't need an internet connection to listen to it. And it also, as I mentioned in the piece, brings together a lot of the kind of languages of Algeria. And it's a really unique listening experience. And so I think for, being Algerian is something that's also been very strong in the diaspora, kind of reassertion of Algerian identity, which has always, been a source of strength, but also a source of tension, given the historic patterns of leaving Algeria and emigration from the interwar period on. And so, Radio Corona International, kind of embracing the diasporic elements of identity has been also really important. And just looking at, this past weekend, there was a huge demonstration in Paris for the Algerian journalist Khalid Jarani, who was sentenced to 2 years in jail. And so as repression ramps up, which it certainly has against, bloggers and journalists and activists, there is a need to have a space to kind of organize around that. Hope that wasn't too long of an answer.
No, not at all. Thank you for that amazing insight, because I think you've really shown how this connects so many different struggles, different forms of art and expression, and really touches on a lot of critical areas, especially during this period with the pandemic and beyond. And you actually touched on something that I was excited to ask you about today, which is how this does impact Algerians, of course, in the country, but in the diaspora as well. And I wanted to ask you, obviously the pandemic is ongoing. It has dramatically shifted the way we all live our lives around the world, as you've just explained. But as things do fluctuate, and you've just given an example from France, and as other forms of protest and expression become possible, perhaps in the ways we more traditionally or conventionally know them, how do you think RCI will have a lasting impact, and specifically on Algerians in the diaspora? I think you've already started to say that it really does fulfill a need that might have been there before, but that now has just been laid out very clearly. And I think it will continue to persist, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I wouldn't want to make any predictions about what the organizers have in mind for RCI, Radio Corona International, in the future. The title of the piece is, carrying the flame of the Hirak. And I know there starting to be discussions about, can we take to the streets again? What will that look like? And so I guess I would encourage us to think about RCI as part of a longer trajectory of civil society, if that's the right word. I don't love that word, but kind of activist grassroots expression. And this is something in the Hirak, even predating the Hirak, the Raj, which is another organization I've written about, which is a kind of youth group based in Algiers, had a radio station. And, it was very young activists, perhaps a bit less polished than RCI is to listen to. But again, the spirit of, we want to have a voice and have access to direct discussion in the public space without being mediated by certain platforms. And so I think, there were street corner debates that were happening during the Hirak. So all of these ways of sociality that were also a kind of a political statement or politicization, not to say that Algerians weren't political before, but it was a new kind of way of being political. I think will continue in one way or another, just because that's been the case for the past 4 or 5 years at least. And so it's, I think with the Hirak, there's a temptation to say, there was nothing and now there's the Hirak. But whether, it was mobilization of the unemployed in the South against, anti-fracking movements that were already talking about how national wealth has been used, already talking about the environment and kind of sustainability, whether it was youth movements or, more individualized forms of protest, there's been a lot happening even before the Hirak. And so I think the RCI can be seen as part of that continuum of critical debate and discussion.
Thank you, for making that important point that this can be seen as part of a continued form of empowerment and activism. And I think that's really important for everyone to understand, and you've put it in a really great, compelling way. And on that note, I think after listening to you today, everyone is definitely going to be intrigued, and those who know your work are going to want to read more, and those who are just familiarizing themselves with these issues, I think will be excited to learn more. So with that, I wanted to ask you, I know that you have a book, I believe, coming out with Duke University Press. Congratulations. So would you like to tell everyone here just briefly what that subject is about and what to expect from that?
Sure. My own work is much less exciting than the Hirak, so people should go read about the Hirak first. But one of the things that I'm interested in is how ideas about Islam and kind of, who Muslims are, which is a colonial, Orientalist area of inquiry for anybody who knows Edward Said's work. And I wanted to think about that not in terms of representations or discourses, but the economy, right? So how do ideas about Muslim aptitudes shape French colonial economic policies? And then how do they influence, and I think here is maybe the more surprising part of my work, how do they influence the post-colonial regime in Algeria in their understanding of a specifically Algerian socialism based in Islam? And so it's really easy to see the discontinuities. You have a colonial regime trying to preserve a colonial system up until 1962, and then you have an independent third worldist regime. But I actually argue that there are some continuities in thinking about Algerian identity and Islam between those two periods, including some of the kind of French third worldist or Trotskyist views of what revolution looks like, which are really shaped by the Algerian experiment in their eyes. And some of the kind of obstacles to thinking about Islam critically on the French left, I argue, can be traced back to some of these debates about, if they want to call it Islamic socialism, that's okay, but when the real revolution comes, they'll rid themselves of these feudal trappings. And similarly, the Algerian regime under Ben Bella wants to see Islam as the center of morality and of kind of a certain kind of aptitude for socialism. So in both cases, Islam becomes the kind of crux of economic policy based on these allegedly inherent aptitudes or capacities. So I hope that hasn't bored everybody so much that they'll never read the book. But that's the elevator pitch, or the long elevator pitch.
No, thank you. It's a really fascinating intersection of ideas, and I think definitely we're all looking forward and eagerly awaiting that. So you'll have to keep us posted.
I will.
We'll leave it there. Thank you for now. But to learn more about this topic, please do read Muriam Haleh Davis's essay. Again, it's called "This is the Voice of Algeria." Radio Corona International carries the torch of the Hirak. It's up on Jadaliyya now, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for chatting. I enjoyed it.
Again, I'm Carly Krakow here on behalf of Jadaliyya and the Arab Studies Institute. For more interviews like this one, including conversations with experts from Jadaliyya, ASI, and from our partners around the world, please tune in for Live with ASI, our new monthly broadcast initiative. Also through Status, our audiovisual journal, you can watch recent interviews with guests including Bashar Dumani, Mona Harb, Robert Vitalis, a panel with several of our experts on Iran, and more. And again, thank you to my wonderful guest, Muriam Haleh Davis, for being with us today. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.